Hello, everyone. In our last lesson together, we left off talking about the anatomy of the heart. I introduced you to this list of terms on this particular diagram in the order through which blood flows through the heart. Okay. Today, I'd like to pick up at the very next slide. Okay, so this is kind of thrown in there to expand upon a couple different structures that are present in the adult heart that are actually remnants of the different fetal circulation. And so just to orient you to these diagrams here, I want to point out that this here is essentially the fetus's, right, baby's belly button. Okay, blood vessels, of course, are coming to enter and exit through the belly button, through the navel, in the umbilical cord. And so that is where baby is going to pick up oxygen, pick up nutrients, drop off any kind of waste products, exchanging materials with the mother. Okay. And so, as you might imagine, in a baby, there is really no need for this blood to therefore go through the lungs. Okay, so all of the oxygen is picked up by interacting with mom's blood and never really from baby's lungs. And so oxygenated blood is going to enter into the fetal circulation via the navel, right? So from the umbilical cord. This is the umbilical vein. Okay, because the blood is flowing towards the heart, towards baby's heart, this is considered to be a vein. It actually passes from the belly button all the way through the liver and dumps blood into the inferior vena cava. Okay, from there, just like in the adult heart, this blood is taken into the right atrium. However, in the adult heart, the right atrium receives only deoxygenated blood. And so what we see is that there is really no reason for this oxygenated blood to get pumped down into the right ventricle and then through the pulmonary trunk and to pick up blood in, or to pick up oxygen within the lungs. And so there are two different ways that the fetal blood circulation actually kind of bypasses the lungs, or at least makes it a little bit more efficient. It doesn't waste quite so much time in that organ where they wouldn't actually get any oxygen. And one of those ways is there is a hole in the interatrial septum. So the wall between the two atria, the right and the left atrium. And so this oxygenated blood that has just interacted with mom's blood way over here can go right from the right atrium directly into the left atrium. Okay, from the left atrium down to the left ventricle, up and out the aorta and to the rest of the body. Okay, another way that the fetal blood circulation more or less bypasses the lungs is via the pulmonary trunk here. Right, so once this blood has been pushed into the right ventricle, up through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk. Okay, usually we would see this bifurcation, this split of the pulmonary trunk into the left and the right pulmonary arteries, but in this case there is a third vessel. Okay, this vessel connects the pulmonary trunk directly to the aortic arch. Okay, and so these structures are called the foramen ovale. Okay, so a foramen, as you learned in A&P 1, means a hole. Ovale means it's an oval hole. Okay, in an adult heart, these structures, both this one and this one, don't just disappear. There are actually remnants of these structures even after we grow up, even after we are adults. And so this whole turns into what is called the fossa ovalis, an oval-shaped indentation, which is what fossa means, as you know from A&P 1, within that interatrial septum. Okay, the other structure is the ductus arteriosus. Okay, the ductus arteriosus ultimately is going to turn into a ligament. Right, so even on an adult heart, on those models that you'll surely see, there's a little white connection here, and that is purely connective tissue at this point. It's kind of a shriveled up old blood vessel, and it's called the ligamentum arteriosum, which probably sounds a heck of a lot like some Harry Potter thing. Whatever you need to do to remember that, go for it, right? So again, the foramen ovale turns into the fossa ovalis. The ductus arteriosus turns into the ligamentum arteriosum. Okay, note the endings of these words. Okay, now there is one more pair of diagrams that I would like to introduce you to by drawing on them. Here are those two diagrams. These were provided to you both in the PowerPoint notes as well as in some extra in an extra file that you can actually draw on. What I want to point out first is a couple of the structures that we already know. Okay, so this is the anterior heart. This is the posterior heart over here. Okay, so we know that blood comes into the right atrium via the SVC and also the IVC. Right? On an exam, including a practical exam, you surely will have to spell these things out, but for our purposes now, SVC and IVC. Okay, so this here is where the right atrium would be. Here is where the right ventricle would be. Okay, meaning that this here is the pulmonary trunk. Okay, pulmonary trunk quickly bifurcates or splits, and it actually is going to come out way over here. Okay, delivering deoxygenated blood to the lungs. These, of course, are the pulmonary. They're taking blood away from the heart, so they are the pulmonary arteries. Okay, on the posterior side of the heart, we can actually see these tubes here as well. So this nice T. This is the SVC. And this big, wide, cavernous vein is the IVC. Right, so vena cava or vena cava, right? Those are a cavernous vein, cavernous veins. Okay, of course, the blood is going to return into the heart, now oxygenated via these vessels. Okay, all right, so it's going back and now it's red, okay, because it's been reoxygenated. For a new perspective on this, we can look at the posterior side of the heart and we can see these vessels are kind of coming together in this area right here. Right, this area is actually the left atrium. Okay, meaning that these vessels that I am drawing for you are the pulmonary veins. And as I said before, this pulmonary circulation is one of the few places where the arteries are blue and the veins are red. Okay, now oxygenated blood is going to drain into the left atrium, which is also right over here, into the left ventricle, right, so way over here, and then it is going to be ejected from the heart via the aorta. Okay, so this here is the aorta. I note that there are 3 branches that we can see in this particular diagram, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, these are B, C, and S, brachiocephalic trunk, left common carotid artery, and left subclavian artery, BCS. Of course, we're looking at this from behind, so B, C, and S. Okay, so I just wanted to briefly introduce you or remind you of those structures that we already know. Okay, so let's add on to this just a little bit. Using the list of terms that I provided for you. There are 8 of them. So we've actually covered some of these again. So really 1 through 4. Okay. Number 1 are the auricles. Now auricles, this word means ear. And so I want to point out that on the anterior surface of the heart are little ear-like flappy things right here. If you ever get a chance to dissect a real heart of any species, you'll actually see that these things can be lifted and they kind of look like elephant ears. And so that's where they get their name from. This is the right auricle. And this over here is the left auricle. Okay, and so the function of these is to essentially increase the volume of the right and the left atrium. Okay, the next thing I want to point out is something we just covered, and that is this guy right here. This is the ligamentum arteriosum, which on your list is number 2. Okay. Now on the posterior side, we have yet another vessel that I have mentioned before. Okay. Very briefly, this here, actually, yeah, so this right here is a vein. If we follow the vessels that are coming into it, right, we'll see that the blood that has just fed the myocardium all is draining into this one single vessel on the posterior side of the heart. Okay, this vessel is called the coronary. Coronary means heart muscle, sinus. Right? It's a big, wide open vein. Okay, so the coronary sinus receives the blood from the entire myocardium. Okay, now if you look at your list, you'll see that the coronary sinus is within something called the coronary sulcus. Right? So sulcus is a groove, and so I would definitely recommend taking a look at some other models, some other images. You will see that the atria kind of curve down into a little indentation here. The ventricles curve down into a little indentation here. And so this sulcus is really sitting inside a little groove. Okay, so that groove is the coronary sulcus, which to me sounds an awful lot like coronary sinus, and I see students get those two confused all the time. And so the part of the heart in which the coronary sinus resides is, yes, called the coronary sulcus, but it is also called the atria, ventricular, right? This is kind of a compound word here, groove. The atrioventricular groove. Okay, so for our purposes, you can tell me either one. Okay, but personally, I find this one to be easier because it literally tells you that it is a groove between the atria and the ventricles. And of course, it doesn't sound an awful lot like the coronary sinus. There is one other term that I skipped over accidentally here, and that is number 3, the coronary arteries. Deep to the right auricle here, right, there's actually another little branch that branches off the aorta, wraps around the anterior side of the heart, right at this atrioventricular junction. Okay, there's another vessel that actually goes behind the pulmonary trunk, behind this corner of the left auricle, and it is going to go down this junction between the right ventricle and the left ventricle, as well as the left atrioventricular junction. Okay, so all of these vessels on the front of the heart can be collectively called the coronary, coronary arteries. Okay, there are more specific names, as you might imagine, but for our purposes, these are collectively the coronary arteries. So now that we know more about the structures of the heart and you've already been briefly introduced to the flow of events within a particular heartbeat, let us elaborate on this concept. This concept is called the cardiac cycle. Okay, so the series of events within one single heartbeat. Okay, so as we can see here, all of the events in a single heartbeat. Remember, as I mentioned in our last class together, the right and the left sides of the heart are essentially two different pumps, but essentially they are working at the same time, right? So as the right atria are doing something, so too are the left atria, right? The right and the left ventricles are also doing the same thing at the same time. So these two pumps are working simultaneously. But when we talk about the cardiac cycle, the general approach to this kind of physiological story is starting at the right atrium, flowing into the right ventricle, the lungs, left atrium, left ventricle, and out to the body. Okay, so that's where we're going to start as well. But keep in mind, this is a cycle. You could, in theory, start anywhere in this story. Okay, a couple more terms that you have to know before we jump into this entirely. The term systole means the contraction phase of the chambers. both the atria and the ventricles undergo a systolic phase, a phase of contraction. Similarly, both the atria and the ventricles undergo a phase of relaxation. Right? So when the muscle cells stretch out, relaxing and allowing a lot more blood to enter those chambers. The relaxation phase is called diastole. Okay? Generally, when you just say the word systole or diastole, you are referring to, or it is understood that you are talking about the ventricles. However, we are going to be specifically referring to both atrial systole and ventricular systole, atrial diastole and ventricular diastole. Okay, so make sure that you keep those straight in your minds. Okay. As we go through these different phases of contraction of one and relaxation of the other, and so on and so forth, we're also going to be connecting in the different heart sounds. Okay, so generally when you think of a heartbeat, you think of lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. And so we're going to talk about, or I'm going to tell you rather, where those sounds come from and when in the cardiac cycle they are going to occur. Finally, at the end of the next segment of this physiological story of our tale of the cardiovascular system, I'm going to add in the ECGs here, so the electrical activity as well. Okay, when we start our story, we start with both types of chambers, both the atria and the ventricles, relaxed. And so this is actually a pretty good representation of what's occurring in both of them. We can see that the atria are relaxed as well as the ventricles being relaxed. Okay, so we're starting here. Here is that heart image that we walked through, and now it's nice and colorful, so you don't forget that this is the pulmonary trunk and this is the aorta, etc. I'm going to refer to this graph right here. It might seem big and clunky and intimidating, but I encourage you to spend some time with it. It really does help to put all of this stuff together, right? So the sounds, the pressures, what's happening with the valves, and so on and so forth. Okay. So the very beginning of this cycle, or where we're going to start the cycle, is when both types of chambers are in diastole. What is occurring here, and I'm going to draw this in for you so that we're all on the same page. Blood is coming in and passively filling both atria. Okay, so they are relaxed. Blood is just flowing in using the momentum that has been generated throughout the rest of the body, using things like the skeletal muscle pump and the respiration pump, which we'll learn about later. So blood is just filling up these chambers. Okay, the valves, right? So both atrioventricular valves, this one is the tricuspid valve, this one is the bicuspid valve. Both of them are still wide open. And so as blood is filling the atria, a little bit is trickling down into the ventricles as well. If we take a look at this graph over here, we see that the yellow line is the atrial pressure, the ventricular, or the green is the ventricular pressure. We can see that at this point, there is really no pressure being generated here. This is just passively filling, passively stretching, no pressures being generated. Right, the third line that we're going to check out is the aortic pressure. So essentially what is happening in here. And as we can see, the aortic pressure is going to drop over the course of this relaxation, this diastolic phase. Okay, and the reason for that is that the heart is relaxed. It's not squeezing blood out into the vessels, and so there's less flow, therefore less pressure. All right, so next, the atria are going to be triggered to contract. Okay, so when the atria contract, they are going to push. Right, so they're going to get smaller and they are going to push the blood down into the ventricles. Right, so simultaneously, the volume of this chamber is getting smaller. Okay, therefore increasing the pressure, and there's going to be a lot more blood in the ventricle, which is of course going to put a lot more pressure on the walls of that chamber. And so we see a little blip, right? A tiny little increase in both the atrial and the ventricular pressures. Okay, so it's not really much to talk about just yet. Okay, something else that I want to point out is the EDV, the end diastolic volume. Okay, so at the end of ventricular diastole, okay, so which is also the end of atrial systole. After this chamber here has pushed as much blood as possible into the ventricle, what we're left with is a certain volume of blood. Okay, this volume of blood is called the EDV, and it's generally 120 milliliters for every single cardiac cycle. And of course, this is occurring in both of these chambers. Okay, next we have atrial diastole, right? So the atria are going to relax, and at the same time, so the atria are going to relax, and then there's going to be a brief moment. All right, so just a tiny fraction of a second, and then the ventricles are going to be triggered to contract. Okay, that pause is going to be really important in making sure that the atria contract or push as much blood as possible into the ventricles, really increasing that EDV as much as they can before the ventricles eject that entire volume of blood. Okay, so as soon as the atria have contracted, the ventricles have paused just a brief, like 10th of a second, the ventricles are going to start contracting. So they're going to start, the walls of the ventricles are going to start coming in, okay, generating lots and lots of pressure. And so we can see the pressure is going to increase quite dramatically in the ventricles. What we also see is that both atrioventricular valves are going to snap shut. Okay, so as the pressure is building in here, okay, these valves are going to close up so that blood does not go backwards, right? The valves want to assure unidirectional flow, so they snap shut, and this actually makes a sound. So when these AV valves close, that is actually the first heart sound, the lub of the lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. Okay. However, the blood is still stuck in those ventricles, right? These semilunar valves, both the pulmonary and the aortic back here, are both still closed. They require a lot of pressure in order to open them up. And so as the volume of the ventricles gets smaller, right, so the walls are closing in, but you still have the same amount of blood in that chamber, the pressure increases very quickly. Okay, and so ultimately you exceed some target threshold. Okay, generally that threshold happens to be the pressure in the circulation. So whatever the pressure is here or the pressure is here, the ventricles have to produce enough pressure to exceed that and therefore open up these valves and push the blood out. Okay, so the semilunar valves open when the ventricular pressure exceeds the blood pressure in your body. Okay, and the ventricle just keeps on going. Right, so we can see that the pressure is still going to increase for a brief moment before it decreases again. Okay, with every single beat, the heart is going to eject a stroke volume of 70 milliliters per beat. So this is the volume of blood ejected from the heart with a single ventricular systole or contraction. All right, coming to the end of the cardiac cycle here. After the ventricles have contracted, so after ventricular systole, they are going to relax. Okay, so we can see that up here, this is the end of the ventricular systole. The ventricles start to relax and start to open up once again, therefore allowing the pressure to drop equally quickly as it raised in the previous phase. As soon as the ventricular pressure is less than the pressure of the, for example, the aorta, the semilunar valves are going to close, right? So these guys are going to snap shut, making sure that blood doesn't fall back into the heart, right? We only want it to go out. We don't want it to go back in, okay? And so again, we hear a sound. The semilunar valves closing is the dub, the second heart sound of the lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. Okay, so take-home message about that is that the heart sounds, the ones that you hear with the stethoscope, are when the valves close, right? The first sound is the AV valves closing, that's these. The second sound is the semilunar valves closing here, okay? All right, so ultimately the pressure falls. This allows the AV valves to open, right? And the heart remains at rest for a brief moment, okay? So here we have both of the chambers, both types of chambers in their diastole, okay? As we can see here, the stroke volume was not equal to the end diastolic volume. That is, all of that blood that the atria initially pushed into the ventricles was not actually pushed out of the heart. In fact, some of that remains behind, right? So the EDV, the end diastolic volume, may have been filling the heart up to here, okay, in the right ventricle. After the stroke, after the systolic phase, there might be just a little bit of blood left behind, right? You can think about trying to squeeze all the toothpaste out of a tube, right? So no matter how you squeeze it and like push it and roll it and whatever, there's always going to be a little bit of toothpaste left in that tube. And so the leftover toothpaste is this here. It is the end systolic volume, right? It is the leftover blood at the end of ventricular systole. Okay, so as we'll see here in a moment, this is the ESV. Okay, so just this little bit right here. This entire volume here is the EDV. Okay, so ESV, EDV, and this amount of blood, right, the stuff in the middle here, is the stroke volume. Okay, so how much blood was actually ejected from the heart in this particular heartbeat. Okay, so let's put that into an equation. The relationship between the stroke volume and EDV, ESV, and something new to us, cardiac output. Okay, so as we just saw in the previous slides, the stroke volume is equal to the end diastolic volume, the amount of blood pushed into the ventricles by atrial systole, minus how much blood is left over, how much toothpaste is left in that tube after you squeeze the heck out of it. Okay, so this is what's ejected, this is what we start with, this is what we left over with. Okay, generally at rest, that is, so when you're sitting there on your couch watching this lesson, the stroke volume should be equal to about 50 to 60% of the end diastolic volume. So if the EDV is about 120 milliliters for every single beat, about 50 milliliters is left over after the beat is completed. That means about 70 milliliters was ejected by the left ventricle. Okay. Cardiac output is calculated by using the stroke volume, which of course we calculated with the EDV and ESV. Cardiac output measures the flow of blood out of each ventricle in 1 single minute. Okay, so this is measured in milliliters per minute or liters per minute. And in general, even at rest, the cardiac output approximately equals the entire volume of your blood. Okay, so the heart is pumping your whole blood volume in every single minute, even without getting up off the couch. Okay, so how do we calculate cardiac output? The heart rate, how many beats per minute, times the stroke volume, milliliters per beat, multiplied together gives us the milliliters per minute. Okay, at rest, again, our cardiac output is more or less the volume of our blood. Okay, so this here, cardiac output, about 5 or 6. In non-athletic people, when they get up off the couch and they start to run away from a bear or something, right, their cardiac output can actually increase 4 to 5 times greater than this resting cardiac output. If you are actually trained, right, so it's not abnormal for you to get off the couch and start running, your cardiac output can be many times your resting cardiac output, right? So when you train, you're not only, you know, reducing your heart rate, you're not only reducing the strain on your heart because it's used to working that hard, but also you can actually become more efficient. Right? The difference between rest and running away from a bear in full-on cardio mode is called the cardiac reserve. And there are some cardiovascular conditions that, even if they are not affecting your heart rate or blood pressure, they do minimize your cardiac reserve. You don't have much extra room to be able to ramp up your cardiovascular activity in the need of more blood to your tissues. All right, so let's take a look at some different factors that affect blood flow. All right, all this time we've been talking about the heart, right, and how it's pumping, where the blood is flowing through it. We've been talking about blood vessels. We know that blood flows from the heart into the vessels and the back into the heart and so on and so forth. Let's talk about what is affecting blood flow. And we know at this point that if you have a higher cardiac output, that means that blood must be flowing pretty darn quickly through your body. Right? We also know at this point that cardiac output is determined by heart rate and stroke volume. Okay. The heart rate is continually controlled by the autonomic nervous system, which we're going to briefly talk about in a couple lessons from now, and the intrinsic mechanism. So even if the heart was outside the body, for as long as the heart has enough cellular currency, enough energy, and the conditions are just right, the heart will actually beat completely on its own. And so good thing we can do heart transplants and keep the heart happy from one human body into the next human body, right? So these intrinsic mechanisms are going to inherently determine the heart rate. We'll get there. Okay. Stroke volume is determined by both the systolic function and the diastolic function, right? So the systolic function, how strong is your heart muscle? How much, how much strength is your heart able to generate, right? And therefore eject the blood. But also, and maybe surprisingly, the stroke volume can be determined by, or affected anyway, by diastolic function, right? So even when the heart is at rest, we can be improving or reducing cardiac output, right? So some examples here are essentially how stretchy is your left ventricle? Okay, so how much blood can it actually accept, right? What is the maximum EDV, right, end diastolic volume in the left ventricle, right? If your heart muscle, right, your myocardium is filled with a lot of scar tissue because of maybe a blood clot, a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, right? It's not going to stretch quite as much, and therefore it can't take in as much blood, and so it can't pump out as much blood. Right, also, the pericardium, right, as I briefly mentioned the other day, the pericardium is, of course, that serous membrane around the heart. If that is filled with fluid, if there is a tumor, if there's some other kind of issue within the pericardium that pushes on the heart, right? And so the heart can't expand as much, even in its resting diastolic phase. And so that will reduce the EDV and ultimately reduce the stroke volume, the cardiac output, and finally, the blood flow. Okay, so systolic function. Okay, the systolic function is affected by three main factors, three well-accepted factors here: the preload, contractility, and afterload. So that's what we're going to go into now. Okay. This little video, there's a link in your notes. I'm not going to play the video. I'm just going to point out the different things on this silly little sketch here, but you are more than welcome to, and in fact encouraged to, play the video. Okay. What the bottle is representing is your ventricle. Okay, what we can see is that during the diastolic phase, the ventricles are receiving lots of blood and they're receiving it passively and filling up as much as they can. The VR here, so the faucet, which is delivering the water into the ventricle or the bottle here, the faucet represents the venous return, and venous return is just how much blood is returning via those veins, right? So the SVC, the IVC, the coronary sinus, right? So all of that stuff dumping back into the right atrium, okay? At the end of diastole, there is a certain volume of water or blood, right? And so this volume is called the EDV, right? How much we're actually starting out with. And the pressure, the force that that water is exerting on the walls of the bottle or of the ventricle, that is called the preload. And that's actually going to determine how much blood is pumped out. Okay. Now, of course, the ventricle is triggered. In this case, we see the hand is going to squeeze on the bottle, stimulating ventricular systole. Okay, so the squeezing, the ventricle is getting smaller. And as we can see, the blood, the water in this case, is being pushed out of the ventricle. Now, what we also see here is that there is a bit of afterload. And so afterload is the pressure that the ventricle must overcome in order to eject the blood from the heart. Okay, so this is essentially, as we're going to see here in a moment, whatever the blood pressure of the aorta is. Okay, so that's the afterload. We need to overcome this, right? In the case of the bottle, there might be a little cap on the bottle, or minimally we have to overcome gravity to get the water out of that bottle. And so the volume of water that is leaving the bottle is called the stroke volume, right? So that's what is physically ejected. And even after the systolic phase, when the hand relaxes, when the ventricle relaxes, there's always going to be just a little bit of blood left over, and that is called the end systolic volume. Okay, so for a lecture exam, you should be prepared to relate venous return, diastole, EDV, preload, systole, afterload, stroke volume, and ESV. Right. So let's talk about these a little bit more so that you have a better understanding. Okay. The strength of the ventricular contraction is increased when the ventricle is stretched prior to the contraction. That is, the more blood is in the ventricle at the beginning of the contraction. All right, so at the end of the resting phase, at the end of diastole, if there's more blood, the heart is going to contract much more strongly. And so this is called the preload, right? How much stretch is there, therefore how much blood is there? Okay, this is part of a larger kind of concept map here. If venous return increases, right? So if you are moving your muscles a lot and therefore squeezing lots of blood up from your extremities, from valve to valve to valve to valve, you're going to end up with a lot more blood in your heart, right? That's going to stretch your ventricle a lot more, which is going to increase the end diastolic volume, right? So more blood in the heart is more volume and diastolic volume, which stretches the heart more. Thus, preload is increased, which is ultimately going to increase the stroke volume, right? It makes sense, hopefully, that the more blood that comes into your heart, the more blood that comes out of your heart, okay? So increasing venous return causes more stretch, right? And that directly increases stroke volume. And so this graph here is a classic demonstration of representation of the relationship between more or less end diastolic volume or pressure here and stroke volume, right? So as venous return increases, more blood is coming into your heart, your stroke volume is going to increase as well. Okay. The Frank-Starling mechanism, or the law of the heart, states that, this is called, right, the Frank-Starling mechanism, or the law of the heart. Okay, so that is the name of this particular relationship. And I can point out that there is, of course, this standard healthy resting Frank-Starling curve, but it's not the only curve. In fact, the other two factors here, afterload and contractility, can shift the curve up or down. So it's not just preload, it's also these other two factors. Okay, so let's talk a teeny bit more about venous return, right? The respiratory pump. Right, as we can see in this diagram over here, this is the diaphragm. Our heart is right here. Our inferior vena cava is draining blood from the rest of our body. And hopefully it gets through the diaphragm and back to our heart. So that is a significant portion of venous return. Okay, every time your lungs expand, right, your diaphragm and your lungs are going to expand way down here, and that is going to put pressure on the IVC. Okay, if there's so much pressure from taking a big deep breath and inhaling, right, which of course you're doing all the time, the pressure exceeds the super low pressure of the blood in the IVC. So every time you take an inhale, the blood returning from all of your lower extremities and all of these organs here is going to stop flowing. Okay. That is, it's going to stop flowing up here to the heart. And so this is one of the many reasons why they tell you to not hold your breath when you're doing sit-ups or when you're exerting yourself a lot, right? Because all of this blood really needs to get back to the heart so we can get more oxygen in it, but it can't if you're holding your breath. There's just way too much pressure right here, okay? However, when you take an exhale, right? Long, deep exhale, all of a sudden, this blood, which has been pooling and unable to go past here, is going to be allowed to flow, right? So the pressure of the thoracic cavity is going to decrease as you exhale. And now this thoracic cavity is a lower pressure than your abdominopelvic cavity. And so this higher pressure fluid is going to flow down its pressure gradient and finally back up to the heart. And so this wild change in pressure with every single breath that you take actually facilitates the flow of a lot of blood up from your extremities and back to your heart. Okay, the other thing that we already talked about the other day was the skeletal muscle pump. The more you contract your muscles, the more that squeezes the veins. When the veins are squeezed, blood is pushed in both directions, but it cannot, as long as your valves are working properly, be pushed down past the valves. It can only be pushed up. And so now the blood is going to be up above this valve, right? And when the muscles relax again, the valve closes, and now the blood is up here and not down here. Okay, so that is the skeletal muscle pump. That's a little reminder for you. The third and final thing is that remember that the veins, like any other tube, have that middle muscle layer. Right? The tunica media contains smooth muscle tissue, which implies that even the veins have the ability to contract and therefore change pressure. In emergency situations, okay, at least situations that your body deems to be emergencies, your body activates the sympathetic division of your autonomic nervous system, the oh crap, I need to get away from a bear, save my life, I'm stressed out, all that kind of stuff system. Okay? The sympathetic nervous system can trigger vasoconstriction, right? So the smaller diameter of the veins, and therefore increasing pressure and pushing back up to the heart. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system can also increase the venous return, and therefore the preload, and therefore the stroke volume. Right? I know that's a lot of words, so make sure that if you don't understand, you can read the textbook, you can practice on mastering A&P, and also, go figure, you can go back and rewind or play again this portion of the YouTube video. All right, afterload. I have mentioned this briefly a couple times now, but the afterload is essentially the blood pressure, right? The pressure of the blood in the aorta that the ventricle must overcome in order to open those semilunar valves. Okay, so the aortic pressure is the afterload. Okay. In the case of the right ventricle, we would be talking about the pulmonary artery pressure. Okay. Increasing the afterload shifts the curve down and to the right. That is, if you have hypertension or high blood pressure, Okay. What that means is that your aortic pressure, instead of being 80 millimeters of mercury when your heart is in diastole, it might be 100, it might be 120, right? So it might be really high. And so the semilunar valves would not be open until all the way up here, right? And so there's very little time, very little opportunity for blood to actually leave the heart, right? Because the valves are open for just a brief moment in time. And so for the same end diastolic volume, or the same pressure within the ventricle, we would have a lower stroke volume when the afterload is increased. Okay. Finally, contractility. This one, again, I give you a little video here. I'm not going to play it. This video has a lot more detail than you would ever need for this class, but I think it does a great job at showing you just a lot of the different mechanisms that lead to differing levels of contractility. Okay, so contractility is the third factor that affects the stroke volume and therefore cardiac output in the heart. Contractility is also called inotropy, and essentially it is a reflection of how strong your heart is. Okay, so this is normal old healthy-ish individual, right? If you are an athlete and you are constantly training, you're constantly going to the gym, your cardiovascular health is going to increase. And one of the many ways that that happens is that the cells themselves in your myocardium are going to get more efficient, right? So again, for the same end diastolic volume, right? Here's a normal old healthy person, and here is a person that trains a lot, so the cardiac output would be much higher than it would be for a normal person of average fitness. Okay. On the other side of this coin is if your heart muscle has been weakened by something like heart failure, right? So these cells are no longer as efficient as they once were. You might have a lot of cell death. And so again, for the same end diastolic volume compared to a healthy person, the cardiac output is going to be much less. And so these individuals are not able to pump their blood efficiently. They get a lot of swelling in their extremities because there's physically not enough pressure and volume to kind of wash the blood up through the veins and back to the heart. Okay. Contractility can be purposely increased in different scenarios, right? So when you get up off the couch after watching this lesson, if you want to take a jog, your sympathetic nervous system will be engaged because you're running now. And so you can actually increase the efficiency of your heart selectively given whatever activity that you're doing. Okay. Epinephrine, also called adrenaline, can do a pretty good job of increasing contractility as well. Okay, so that is the end of this segment of the lesson. There is another video after this that will finally complete this section of the PowerPoint notes. The next PowerPoint notes are described for you in the next series of videos. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you in our next class.